In the heart of a raging storm, one woman made a choice that would change her forever. Against the fury of nature, she risked everything to save 3 helpless brown bear cubs. This is a story of courage, survival, and an unbreakable bond born from the wild. Do not miss a single heartbeat of this incredible journey. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and stay with us for the most powerful and emotional stories that nature has to offer. The smell of wet earth already hung heavy in the air when Elena Maris planted her boots into the damp forest ground. Her black hair, tightly braided, swayed with the wind that was beginning to howl through the ancient trees of the Winter Hollow Mountains. The sky, once a pale gray, now thickened into ominous shades of dark steel. She clutched her worn jacket tighter around her chest, feeling the first shivers of cold slicing through her skin. Elena was not a woman who frightened easily. A veteran of solitary trails and survival in the wild, she knew the signs well. The way the forest changed its voice, the way the air grew heavy with unseen warnings. Something big was coming. The trees, tall and twisted, seemed to whisper to each other, swaying in restless murmurs. High up on the mountains, timid flashes of lightning began to split the sky like whispered threats. The wind grew stronger, carrying with it the distant grumble of thunder still gathering its strength. Elena stopped for a moment. Her gaze locked on the horizon where the clouds were piling up like armies preparing for battle. "You are going to be one of those nights," she muttered to herself, her voice rough from the moisture in the air. Her instincts told her to head back to camp, which was no more than half an hour away. But something about the thick, vibrating atmosphere rooted her feet to the spot, as if the forest wanted to share a secret before the storm unleashed its full fury. She tightened the straps of her backpack against her shoulders, feeling the reassuring weight of the few tools she carried. She took a deep breath. Every step forward was muffled by the soft, spongy ground, as if the forest itself wanted to swallow her whole. Up above, a silent flash of lightning split the sky, briefly revealing the endless maze of trees and rocks. Then, almost immediately, a thunderclap exploded with such force that Elena flinched. "I better hurry," she whispered, but her voice was quickly swallowed by the growing roar of the wind. She did not know it yet, but tonight the storm would not be her greatest challenge. Elena moved quickly, weaving between low branches and slippery rocks, as the first heavy drops of rain started to fall, stinging her face like tiny cold needles. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the forest, alive and wild, was trying to hold her back with invisible hands. Then she froze. A sound, a desperate whisper cut through the roar of the wind and made her blood turn cold. At first, she thought it was just the wind crying between the trees. But when she stopped moving and held her breath, she heard it clearly. A cry, sharp, painful, fragile. Elena frowned, turning her head toward the source of the sound. It was a small whimper, almost human, mixed with the rough breathing of tiny creatures in distress. The whole forest seemed to hold its breath around her, as if it wanted her to witness something. Her heart started to pound faster. Logic screamed for her to keep moving. The storm was about to break loose with full fury, and getting lost out there could be fatal. But there was something in that sound, something raw and aching that anchored her in place. "I cannot just ignore this," she murmured to herself, feeling her throat dry up. The wind pushed harder now, throwing leaves and twigs against her body like tiny whips. Even so, moved by a force stronger than fear or reason, Elena started walking toward the cries. Each step pulled her deeper into the forest's tangled heart, each step drawing her farther from safety. The darkness throbbed between the trees. Elena moved carefully, her senses wide open. Her eyes scanned the thick brush ahead, but the cries seemed to drift with the wind, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, playing tricks on her mind. Suddenly, a powerful gust of wind snapped a dry branch out of her path, revealing a small clearing where the weak light of the storm showed trembling, huddled shapes. Elena stopped dead in her tracks, her heart hammering, her eyes wide with disbelief. What waited for her in that clearing was something far beyond what she had expected. At the center of the clearing, huddled under a pile of fallen branches, were 3 bear cubs. Their brown fur, soaked by the rain that was now coming down harder, shook violently with every cold gust of wind. Their wide, frightened eyes caught the little light that still managed to filter through the storm clouds. Elena felt her stomach tighten with a surge of fear and overwhelming compassion. Never, in all her years of wandering the wild, had she seen something so exposed, so brutally vulnerable. Her instincts kicked in, and her gaze swept the edges of the clearing, searching for any sign of the mother. Every shadow between the trees looked suspicious. Every rustle in the leaves could mean danger, but there was nothing. No growl, no heavy steps, no warning. Only the distant rumble of thunder and the soft, desperate whimpering of the cubs. The absence of the mother did not bring relief, it brought an even deeper sense of dread. Elena knew better than anyone. A mother bear could unleash a terrifying rage to defend her young. If these cubs were alone, it could only mean that something terrible had happened. She took a careful step forward. The smallest cub, terrified, backed even deeper under the branches, letting out a tiny, broken cry that cut straight through Elena's heart. The largest cub, although just as scared, lifted its head slightly and stared at her, its body shaking but its eyes filled with stubborn bravery. The first heavy drops turned into sheets of rain, drenching the clearing, turning the ground into slippery mud. Lightning flashed across the sky, painting the scene in sharp, cold light for a split second before plunging everything back into a deeper darkness. Inside her mind, survival instincts screamed louder than the storm. Walk away. Leave them. This is not your fight. But something deeper held her feet where they stood. Something that went beyond logic, beyond fear, an unspoken force, rooted in her very soul. Elena crouched slowly, keeping her hands open and low, trying to show she meant no harm. Her voice, soft and hoarse, from the cold air broke the tension. It is all right, Dot. I am not going to hurt you, she whispered, unsure if the words mattered at all, but needing to say them anyway. The cubs seemed to catch the tone, if not the meaning. The smallest let out a faint whimper, while the largest kept staring, as if trying to decide whether she was another threat or an impossible hope. Another bolt of lightning lit up the clearing, showing just how fragile they really were. Mud clung to their paws, and the chill was sinking into their tiny bodies. If they stayed out there much longer, they would not survive until morning. The rain hammered harder, and the forest around them groaned under the weight of the storm. Elena knew she had to decide and fast. The world around her dissolved into water, mud, and fear. Yet there she stood, only a few heartbeats away from 3 tiny lives that depended entirely on what she would do next. For a long moment, Elena stayed completely still, soaked to the bone, feeling cold water running down her back and seeping through every layer of her clothing. Each beat of her heart echoed through the heavy silence between the claps of thunder, counting down seconds she could no longer afford to waste. The forest, wild and furious, seemed to close in around her, demanding her answer. She knew the risks. Carrying bear cubs meant risking her life in the most reckless way possible. If the mother was still alive and nearby, one human scent could set off a deadly rage. And there was the storm itself, furious and wild, threatening to tear apart anything left exposed. But there was something in the cub's eyes, something so raw and helpless, that tore down every wall of fear and caution she had ever built. This choice was not a matter of logic. It was not a calculation. It came from somewhere deeper, older than thought itself. Moving quickly, Elena pulled her backpack off her shoulders and opened it. Her fingers, trembling from the cold, searched through the soaked contents until she found a thin emergency blanket. She worked fast, ignoring the pain shooting through her numb hands. Using her small knife, she tore the blanket into 2 wide strips, then tied them into makeshift slings with the last piece of rope she had left. She approached the cubs slowly, speaking in a low, soothing voice, her hands open and steady. The smallest cub let out a broken whimper but did not move away as she gently wrapped him in the first sling, securing him against her chest where he immediately burrowed into her warmth. The second cub, slightly bigger and more nervous, growled weakly when she reached for him. Elena stayed patient, murmuring softly, letting him see her hands, letting him feel her calm. After a long, shaking breath, she wrapped him in the second sling and tied it securely across her shoulder. The third cub, the biggest, hesitated. He looked at her, then looked at his siblings bundled against her body. After a few tense seconds, he took a few steps forward, giving in with a soft sound. Elena smiled. A small, tired smile that felt like it carried the weight of the whole world. She bundled the third cub as best she could, balancing their combined weight awkwardly against her aching back and shoulders. Each step now felt like dragging the entire forest along with her. The mud sucked at her boots, the wind slammed against her, and the rain blinded her at every turn. "Hold on tight," she whispered, her teeth chattering as she leaned into the storm. Lightning split the sky again, revealing the path ahead only for a moment. Trees torn and twisted by the wind, broken branches like skeletal arms clawing at the sky. Elena knew she needed shelter and fast. They would not survive much longer out in the open, not like this. She pushed forward into the teeth of the storm, carrying not just her own fragile hope, but the trembling, beating hearts of 3 tiny creatures who now trusted her completely. There was no turning back, only forward. The world around them had become a battlefield between the gods and the earth. The forest, once majestic and serene, now twisted and groaned under the brutal assault of wind and pounding rain. Trees bent like they were made of paper. The ground turned into a treacherous swamp, and every step Elena took demanded a strength she was not even sure she had left. The cubs clung to her with desperate little paws, their bodies shaking against her chest. Even though they were terrified, there was a trust there now, raw and unspoken, that cut deeper into Elena's heart with every passing minute. She could feel their tiny hearts racing, and the knowledge that they depended completely on her filled her with a fierce, almost savage determination. Each footstep sank deep into the mud, threatening to the cold, dark earth. Branches whipped across her face, scratching at her skin, leaving behind burning cuts. Once, a huge tree crashed down nearby with a deafening crack that made the ground tremble. Instinct made her freeze, body tensed, waiting for the worst, but there was no time to lose herself in fear. She could not run. Running would mean slipping, falling, risking the precious lives pressed against her. She had to move forward carefully, pushing through the chaos with a steady force that seemed impossible even to herself. Her muscles screamed with each movement. Pain lit up her body with every breath. There were moments she thought she might collapse right there, in the heart of the raging forest. Her vision blurred, her lungs burned as if she was breathing knives. Still, she refused to stop. He refused to stop, with a steady force that seemed impossible even to herself. Their muscles screamed with each movement. Pain lit up her body with every dirge. There were of the raging forest. Her vision blurs as furs breathing knives. Still, she refused to stop. "Just a little longer," she whispered hoarsely, unsure if the words were meant for the cubs or for herself. Ahead of her, a steep, muddy hill loomed, slick with water and broken by twisted roots. It looked impossible to climb, especially with the cubs weighing down her every move. Elena stared at it, feeling her heart sink, but she knew there was no choice. She dug her boots into the mud, grasped onto the exposed roots, and began to climb. Hand over hand, knee over knee, she dragged herself up the slope. Mud covered her arms and legs, clinging to her like a living thing. Several times she slipped, her body lurching backward, but every time she tightened her hold, gritting her teeth against the cold and exhaustion. When she finally reached the top, she stumbled to her knees, gasping for breath. Her body shook violently, but the cubs were still there, still safe. That thought alone gave her the strength to push herself up again. The storm roared louder behind her, but up ahead, through the sheets of rain and the ghostly light of dawn, she saw it, a dark opening in a rocky hill. A cave, shelter. Hope surged inside her, burning away the cold for a brief, powerful moment. She pushed forward, ignoring the screaming protests of her body. Her boots slipped and slid across the soaked ground, but she kept moving, driven by a force stronger than fear. When she reached the mouth of the cave, she almost collapsed. Staggering inside, she finally let herself fall to her knees, cradling the cubs close. The ground was cold and hard, but it was dry. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were out of the storm. Elena knew there was still danger ahead. They were not safe yet. But for now, within the dark shelter of the cave, wrapped in the fragile cocoon of warmth and life, they had won one more battle against the night. And for now, that was enough. Inside the cave, the air was heavy, thick with the damp smell of earth and old moss. The storm outside roared with an almost living rage, making the stone walls tremble slightly, as if the mountain itself was breathing under the weight of the sky's fury. In that dark hollow, Elena allowed herself a brief moment to press her forehead against the cold ground, feeling her body struggle to balance between exhaustion and the urgent need to act. The cubs whimpered softly in her arms, their tiny bodies shivering with the kind of cold that seeped deep into the bones. With trembling hands, Elena sat down, pulling them closer into her lap. Immediately, they pressed into her, desperate for any scrap of warmth she could offer. She dug into her backpack with what little strength she had left. Her supplies were almost gone, soaked and battered by the storm, but she still had a few essentials. A small lighter, a handful of dry twigs protected in a waterproof pouch, and scraps of cloth torn from an old shirt. Working with fingers numb and slow, Elena tried to spark a fire. Each flick of the lighter was a painful battle against the cold. Each failed attempt a heavy blow against her draining spirit. The cold gnawed at her skin like invisible teeth, and for a moment, doubt crept into her heart. Maybe it would be too late. Maybe the storm had already taken too much. Then, finally, a tiny spark caught. A fragile flame flickered into life, small and shivering like the cubs themselves. Elena cupped her hands around it, feeding it bits of cloth and twigs with gentle patience. The flame grew, licking at the dry fuel, casting long, quivering shadows across the stone walls. Warmth, faint but real, began to push back the cold. The light painted Elena's dirt-streaked face in soft golds and oranges. She pulled the cubs closer to the fire, shielding them as best she could. One by one, they edged toward the warmth, their small bodies finally relaxing. The smallest fell asleep almost instantly, his tiny chest rising and falling in steady, exhausted rhythm. The second curled up closer to the fire, his eyes blinking slowly before drifting shut. The third, the strongest, stayed awake longer, watching Elena with wide, cautious eyes. She smiled gently, running her hand over his damp, bristly fur. He did not pull away. Instead, he let out a deep, contented sigh, nestling closer to her side. For a little while, nothing else existed but the crackle of the fire and the slow, even breathing of the sleeping cubs. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cave, they had built something fragile and precious, something stronger than fear. Elena leaned back against the wall, allowing herself to finally cry, not from fear or sadness, but from the overwhelming relief that flooded through her. Hot tears mixed with the dirt on her cheeks, and she whispered into the warm, smoky air. "You are so small," she said, her voice thick and broken. "But tonight, you were giants." The fire crackled softly, wrapping them all in a cocoon of light. Elena knew the danger was not completely over. The world outside was still wild and ruthless, but for now, in that tiny flickering circle of life, they had survived. And that was enough. The dawn arrived heavy with silence, broken only by the steady drip of rainwater sliding down the rocks above the cave. Elena had stayed awake most of the night, her body aching, her mind sharp with a constant, careful alertness. Every so often, she would feed the little fire with damp twigs, protecting it like a fragile heartbeat in the overwhelming darkness. The cubs slept deeply beside her, warmed by the fire and the thin scraps of food she had managed to share, pieces of dried fruit and rough biscuits from her pack. When the first faint line of pale light touched the entrance of the cave, casting soft silver across the damp forest floor, Elena felt it a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. a sound reached her ears, low and steady, different from the wind or the rain. She rose slowly, her muscles stiff, and moved carefully toward the mouth of the cave. Her breath caught in her chest when she saw it through the thinning mist. There, moving heavily between the trees, was a large shape. It was her, the mother bear. Elena's heart slammed against her ribs. The sight of the bear, soaked and scarred her powerful body, straining forward, with desperate purpose, cut through Elena like a knife. That creature had survived the storm, had fought through the nightmare outside, driven by nothing but the need to find her young. Tension gripped Elena's entire body. She knew how dangerous this moment was. Any wrong move, even a whisper of threat, and she would be seen as the enemy. Slowly, she raised her hands, standing tall but still, offering no challenge. The mother bear advanced, nostrils flaring as she sniffed the damp air. Every massive step was careful, almost hesitant. The small fire behind Elena flickered, casting thin shadows across the stone, illuminating the tiny sleeping forms of the cubs. When the mother saw them, she stopped. A sound, deep and raw, rumbled from her chest, a low vibrating call that filled the cave with a gravity that words could never capture. The cubs stirred, at once blinking sleepily, and then, with small cries of joy, they scrambled toward her. Elena stepped back immediately, giving them space. Her heart felt like it would shatter with the force of emotion surging inside her. The cubs threw themselves against their mother's legs and chest, nuzzling and whining, and the massive bear bent down, brushing her muzzle over each of them, inspecting them, reassuring herself that they were truly there, truly alive. Elena stood in silence, not daring to breathe too loudly. The mother bear turned her head slightly then, looking at her not with anger, but with something far deeper, recognition. A silent acknowledgement passed between them, as ancient as the earth beneath their feet. There were no words. There was no need for any. The mother bear turned back to her cubs, nudging them gently, and together, they moved away from the cave, back into the forest that still glistened under the last heavy drops of rain. Elena watched them go, feeling a weight lift from her soul. Even as tears filled her eyes, she sank down onto the cave floor, her legs too weak to hold her any longer. They were safe, and somehow in that dark and brutal night, she had become part of something far bigger than herself, a story that belonged to the wild, a bond that crossed the boundaries of language and fear. She had saved them, and in a way she could never explain, they had saved her too. The sky slowly brightened, brushing the scattered clouds with soft gold and gentle pink, while the forest, still damp and dark, began to breathe again. Elena stayed kneeling at the entrance of the cave, her chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. She watched the first real light of day spill across the soaked earth, felt the cool air fill her lungs, and listened to the new silence, the silence after survival. Ahead of her, between the trees bathed in dawn's first light, she caught one last glimpse of the mother bear and her cubs. They moved steadily into the woods, their shapes blending into the endless green and shadow, becoming once more part of the wild that had birthed them. There was no farewell, no ceremony, just life, raw and honest, reclaiming itself. Elena stayed still for a long while, not out of exhaustion, though it filled her bones, but because she knew something sacred had happened. The fire behind her crackled gently, sending thin trails of smoke into the cool morning. Its warmth touched her back, but it was the warmth inside her chest that she noticed more. Slowly she rose to her feet, her muscles protesting. Mud caked her boots, dirt streaked her clothes and skin, and countless small cuts burned with every movement. Yet none of that mattered. What mattered was what had stayed with her. She began to walk toward the trail, her steps slow but steady. The forest around her felt different now, less a maze of dangers, and more a living, breathing presence. Every leaf, every branch seemed to hum with a quiet recognition, as if the woods themselves knew what she had done, and in their own way accepted her. When she reached a small overlook on the trail, Elena paused. She turned to look back at the vast sea of trees and mist that stretched as far as her eyes could see. Somewhere in that endless green, the bear family was moving forward, Stronger now, whole, she knew she would never see them again. And that was how it should be. What had happened between them belonged to a place beyond memory or storytelling. It lived in the marrow of her bones now, woven into her spirit like roots into the earth. A silent bond, a promise without words. As the first real beam of sunlight broke through the thinning clouds and touched her face, Elenia smiled a small, tired, genuine smile. Without looking back again, she adjusted the straps of her worn backpack and moved forward, her steps sure and quiet, carrying with her something no storm, no fear, no passing time could ever take away. The storm had passed, and with it a new day had been born.